Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Like you were watching someone else make all the important decisions while you stood helpless on the sidelines? Maybe you know what it feels like when your family's choices become your burden to carry. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story is about what happens when you're forced to pay for someone else's mistakes with your entire future. Isadora Castellano stared at her reflection in the antique mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at her. The wedding dress hung on her small frame like beautiful armor she'd never wanted to wear. White silk and Italian lace that probably cost more than her family had seen in years, all purchased by the man she was about to marry. A man who had made it perfectly clear this was a business transaction, nothing more. Her fingers trembled as she tried to fasten the pearl necklace her mother had pressed into her hands an hour ago. The same pearls her grandmother had worn, and her great-grandmother before that. 4 generations of Castellano brides had worn these pearls on their wedding days, but Isadora was the first who felt like she was attending her own funeral instead of her wedding. The bedroom door opened behind her, and her father stepped inside. Vincent Castellano looked older than his 58 years, his once proud shoulders now permanently curved inward, as if he was trying to make himself smaller. The gambling debts had done that to him, turned a man who used to fill every room he entered into someone who apologized for existing. "Papa," she wanted to say, "tell me we can find another way. Tell me you'll figure something else out." But the words stuck in her throat because they both knew there was no other way. The Torino family didn't negotiate payment plans for 6-figure gambling debts. They collected what they were owed, one way or another, and if Vincent couldn't pay with money, they'd take his daughter instead. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Vincent said quietly, his voice heavy with guilt and regret. "Your mother would be so proud." Mama would be horrified, Isadora thought, but didn't say. Her mother had died 3 years ago, before Vincent's gambling had spiraled completely out of control, before he'd gotten in so deep with the wrong people that his only child became collateral. Sofia Castellano had believed in love, in marrying for the right reasons, in building a life with someone who chose you because they couldn't imagine existing without you. This wasn't that. This was a transaction, pure and simple. Luciano Santori got a wife to satisfy some family obligation or business arrangement she didn't fully understand. Vincent's debt disappeared, and Isadora got to spend the rest of her life married to a man who had looked at her exactly once during their brief meeting 2 weeks ago, assessed her like livestock, and nodded his approval to his attorney. The pearls finally clasped. Isadora turned away from the mirror. She couldn't look at herself anymore, couldn't see the fear and resignation in her own eyes. At 22, she was supposed to be starting her life, maybe finishing art school, definitely not walking down the aisle to marry a stranger who controlled half the legitimate businesses in Chicago and probably twice as many illegitimate ones. "It's time," Vincent said softly. Isadora nodded, not trusting her voice. She picked up the bouquet someone had delivered that morning. White roses and baby's breath, classic and impersonal. Everything about this wedding felt like it had been ordered from a catalog of appropriate choices rather than selected with love or care. They walked down the marble staircase of the Santori mansion, Isadora's heels clicking against stone that probably cost more per square foot than most people's houses. The mansion was beautiful in a cold, intimidating way. All dark wood and expensive art, crystal chandeliers that caught the afternoon light and threw it around like scattered diamonds. It was the kind of place that made you whisper automatically, that made you feel small and out of place if you didn't belong to the world of people who owned such things. The ceremony was taking place in what Luciano's people called the garden room, though it was more like a conservatory with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking perfectly manicured grounds. About 30 people were seated in elegant chairs arranged in neat rows, most of them strangers to Isadora. Vincent had been allowed to invite 3 people: his sister Maria, his oldest friend Carlo, and Mrs. Benedetto from next door who had known Isadora since she was born. Everyone else belonged to Luciano's world. Dark suits and expensive jewelry, faces that revealed nothing, eyes that assessed everything. These were people accustomed to power, to having their presence noticed and respected. Isadora felt like an imposter walking among them, a girl from the working-class neighborhood who was about to become something she'd never wanted to be. Luciano stood at the front of the room, next to a priest who looked uncomfortable with the entire proceeding. Even from across the room, Luciano commanded attention without trying. He was tall, probably 6 foot, with the kind of broad shoulders that spoke of both natural strength and hours spent maintaining it. His dark hair was styled perfectly, his olive skin suggesting Mediterranean heritage, and his suit probably cost more than Vincent made in 6 months. But it was his eyes that made Isadora's stomach clench with nerves. Green-gray eyes that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing, that looked at her as she walked down the makeshift aisle like he was calculating her value rather than appreciating her beauty. There was no warmth there, no affection, certainly no love. Just cold assessment and what might have been mild satisfaction that she cleaned up well enough to suit his purposes. The ceremony passed in a blur of words that felt like they were being spoken about someone else. Isadora heard herself making vows she didn't mean to a man she didn't know, promising to love and honor someone who had made it clear he expected neither from her. When Luciano slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands were warm and steady while hers were cold and shaking. The ring was beautiful, a vintage setting with a diamond that caught the light and threw it back in brilliant flashes, but it felt heavy on her hand like a shackle disguised as jewelry. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Luciano leaned down to kiss her, and for just a moment Isadora wondered if maybe this could work somehow. His lips were warm and firm against hers, and there was a split second where she felt something that might have been attraction, might have been hope. Then he pulled away, and his eyes were just as cold as before. The kiss had been for show, for the witnesses, for the legal requirement of completing the ceremony. It hadn't meant anything to him at all. The reception was brief and formal, more like a business meeting than a celebration. People congratulated Luciano on his marriage like they were congratulating him on a successful merger, which Isadora supposed they were. She stood beside him while he accepted handshakes and brief conversations in Italian that she couldn't follow, feeling like a decorative accessory that completed his outfit. When it was finally over, after the last guest had left and Vincent had hugged her goodbye with tears in his eyes, Luciano turned to her with the same cold politeness he'd shown all day. "Maria will show you to your rooms," he said, his voice exactly as emotionless as she'd expected. "You're in the East Wing. I trust you'll be comfortable there." "My rooms?" Isadora asked, confused. "Not our rooms." Luciano's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those green-gray eyes that might have been amusement or might have been contempt. "You're just my wife on paper," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly empty garden room. "Don't expect more than that. We both know what this is." The words hit her like a physical blow, even though she'd known this was how it would be. Hearing it stated so bluntly, so coldly, made it real in a way that all her mental preparation hadn't. This man didn't want her, didn't care about her, probably didn't even particularly like her. She was an obligation he'd accepted to clear a debt, nothing more. "I understand," she managed to say, proud that her voice came out steady even though she felt like she was breaking apart inside. "Good. Maria will explain the household rules. I prefer to keep regular hours and I don't like disruptions. As long as you remember that we're both here for business purposes, we should get along fine." He turned and walked away then, leaving her standing alone in her wedding dress in a room full of empty chairs and dying flowers. Maria appeared a moment later, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner who led Isadora through corridors and up another marble staircase to a suite of rooms in the East Wing that were beautiful and comfortable and felt like the most elegant prison cell in the world. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Santori," Maria said softly, and there was genuine sympathy in her voice that suggested she understood exactly what kind of family Isadora had just joined. When Maria left her alone, Isadora sat on the edge of the enormous bed in her wedding dress and finally allowed herself to cry. Not the dramatic sobbing she'd expected, just quiet tears for the life she'd lost, the dreams that had died, the love she'd probably never have. Outside her window, the sun was setting over Luciano's perfectly manicured grounds, painting everything golden and beautiful and utterly foreign. She was married now. She was Mrs. Luciano Santori, wife to one of the most powerful men in Chicago, and she had never felt more alone in her entire life. The first week of marriage passed like living in a luxury hotel where she'd accidentally booked a room next to a stranger who happened to share her last name. Isadora quickly learned the rhythm of Luciano's life, not through conversation, but through careful observation and Maria's gentle guidance about household routines. Luciano woke at 5:30 every morning. She could hear the shower running in his suite on the opposite end of the east wing, followed by the quiet sounds of him dressing and leaving for his home office. By 6:15, he was already on phone calls that she could sometimes hear through the walls when she pressed her ear against them. Conversations in rapid Italian that sounded like business but carried an edge of violence that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. She learned to time her own morning routine to avoid him. By the time she made it downstairs for breakfast, he was either locked in his office or had left entirely for meetings in the city. Maria would have coffee and fresh pastries waiting, along with apologetic explanations that Mr. Santori preferred to eat alone when he was working. The mansion felt enormous when she was by herself. Isadora had grown up in a 3-bedroom house where you could hear every conversation through thin walls, where privacy meant closing a door and hoping no one needed to get past you. Here, she could walk for 10 minutes without seeing another person, could get lost in corridors that led to rooms she hadn't known existed. The third day, she discovered the library. It was tucked away on the second floor, behind double doors that opened onto a room that took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, filled with leather-bound volumes in multiple languages. Rolling ladders provided access to the higher shelves, and comfortable reading chairs were positioned near tall windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. But what stopped her completely was the art. Original paintings hung between the bookshelves, not the cold modern pieces she'd expected, but warm, intimate portraits and landscapes that spoke of genuine appreciation rather than investment value. A Monet water lily study that she'd only ever seen in textbooks. A small Picasso from his blue period. A Van Gogh sketch that made her hands itch to pick up a brush again. She stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to enter, afraid she was trespassing in a space too beautiful for someone like her. This wasn't just decoration. Someone had chosen these pieces with love, had created this room as a sanctuary for someone who genuinely appreciated beauty and knowledge and art. You can go in. Isadora spun around to find Luciano standing behind her, and her heart immediately started racing the way it did every time she encountered him unexpectedly. He was wearing dark jeans and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, more casual than she'd ever seen him, and somehow the informal clothes made him seem even more intimidating rather than less. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was just exploring. Maria said it was okay to look around the house." "It is okay. This is your home now." Luciano stepped past her into the library, and she caught a hint of his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her think of leather and cedar. "The books belong to my mother. I had them moved here after she died." The admission surprised her. It was the first personal thing he'd shared, the first crack in the wall of formal politeness he'd maintained since their wedding. She followed him into the room, watching as he ran his fingers along the spine of a worn volume of Italian poetry. She had good taste, Isadora said softly, looking at a small portrait of a woman with dark hair and gentle eyes that must have been his mother. "The art is incredible. She was an art history professor before she married my father." Luciano's voice was carefully neutral, but Isadora thought she detected something underneath, a warmth that he was trying to hide. She always said that beauty was the only thing that made life bearable when everything else went wrong. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Isadora wanted to ask what had gone wrong, wanted to ask about the woman in the portrait who had collected beauty like armor against pain, but Luciano's expression was already closing off again. "Feel free to read anything you'd like," he said, back to the formal politeness. "Just please be careful with the older volumes." He left then, and Isadora was alone with his mother's books and paintings, feeling like she'd been given a glimpse of something precious and secret that she wasn't supposed to see. The next morning, she woke early and decided to make breakfast. It was something to do with her hands, a way to feel useful in a house where everything was done for her. Maria had shown her the kitchen the day before, a chef's dream with professional-grade appliances and marble countertops that probably cost more than most people's cars. She was standing at the massive stove, attempting to make pancakes the way her mother had taught her, when she heard footsteps behind her. "You don't need to do that." Luciano's voice made her jump, and she nearly dropped the spatula. He was fully dressed for the day in an expensive charcoal suit, but his hair was still slightly damp from the shower, and he smelled like soap and aftershave. The combination of formal business attire and subtle intimacy made her suddenly aware that they were married, that he was her husband, that under different circumstances this might have been a normal domestic scene between two people who loved each other. "I wanted to," she said, flipping a pancake that was probably burned on one side. "I'm not used to having everything done for me. Maria handles the cooking." "I know, but I like to cook. It makes me feel—" She searched for the right word. "Normal, I suppose." Something flickered across his face at that, an expression too quick for her to interpret. He moved closer to look at her pancakes, and she was suddenly conscious of the fact that she was wearing pajama pants and an old college sweatshirt, that her hair was in a messy bun, that she probably looked like exactly what she was, a girl who didn't belong in his sophisticated world. "They smell good," he said, and his voice was gentler than she'd ever heard it. "Would you like some?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, before she could remember that he preferred to eat alone, that their relationship was supposed to be purely formal. Luciano hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might say yes. She could see the internal struggle playing out across his features, could see him wanting something he thought he wasn't allowed to have. Then his phone rang. "Excuse me," he said, stepping away to answer it. "Pronto." The conversation that followed was in rapid Italian, but Isadora didn't need to understand the words to recognize the tone. Business, and not the kind conducted in boardrooms. Luciano's voice went hard and cold, and she caught words that sounded like threats, like promises of violence if certain conditions weren't met. This was what she'd married into. Not just wealth and power, but the kind of power that came from fear, that was maintained through force. Luciano wasn't just a businessman. He was dangerous in ways she was only beginning to understand. When he hung up, his expression was completely closed off again. "I have to go," he said, already moving toward the door. "There's a situation that requires my attention." "Of course," Isadora said, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice. He paused in the doorway, looking back at her standing there with her spatula and her burned pancakes and her obvious disappointment. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for the offer. Maybe another time." But they both knew there wouldn't be another time. Whatever moment had existed between them was gone, replaced by the cold reality of who he was and what their marriage really meant. That evening, Isadora found herself walking through the mansion's gardens as the sun set. The grounds were as perfectly maintained as everything else about Luciano's life, with geometric flower beds and pathways that led to hidden alcoves and water features. It was beautiful in a formal way, like something from a magazine, but it felt empty somehow, like a stage set rather than a place where people actually lived and loved and made memories. She was sitting on a stone bench near a fountain, sketching the play of light on water in a notebook she'd found in the library, when she heard footsteps on gravel. Luciano appeared around a corner of the path, having traded his business suit for dark slacks and a sweater that made him look younger, less intimidating. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the fading light. "You draw?" he said, nodding toward her notebook. "I used to. Before." She gestured vaguely, encompassing their marriage, her changed circumstances, everything that had brought her here. "I was studying art in college before my father's situation became impossible." "Show me." The request surprised her, but she turned the notebook so he could see the sketch. It wasn't finished, just rough lines and shading, but it captured something about the way the fountain caught the last rays of sunlight that a photograph couldn't have shown. "You're talented," Luciano said, and she could tell he meant it. "Why did you stop?" "Hard to justify art school when your family can't afford to eat." The words came out more bitter than she'd intended, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not pity, exactly, but understanding. Recognition of what it meant to have choices taken away by circumstances beyond your control. "You could start again," he said quietly. "The studio on the third floor has good light. It hasn't been used in years." Another glimpse of something personal, another crack in his carefully maintained facade. Isadora wondered who had used that studio, wondered what other secrets this house held about the life Luciano had lived before she became part of it. "Thank you," she said. "That's very generous." They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the last light fade from the sky. It was almost peaceful, almost normal, almost like they were two people who had chosen to be together rather than two strangers bound by legal documents and financial obligations. Then Luciano stood up abruptly, and the moment was broken. "I should let you get back inside," he said, his voice once again carefully polite. "It gets cold out here after dark." He walked away without waiting for her response, leaving Isadora alone in the garden with her notebook and the growing certainty that her husband was fighting something inside himself just as hard as she was fighting her growing attraction to him. The art studio on the third floor became Isadora's sanctuary over the next week. True to his word, Luciano had left it unlocked for her, and she'd found it exactly as he'd described. A sun-filled room with north-facing windows and an easel that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There were still tubes of paint in the drawers, brushes soaking in turpentine that had long since evaporated, and canvases stacked against the wall covered in dust sheets. Someone had painted here once, and recently enough that the supplies weren't completely dried out. Isadora found herself wondering who it had been, whether it was another family member, whether this was another piece of Luciano's past that he kept carefully locked away from the world. She'd started with simple sketches, just to get her hands moving again, but gradually she found herself attempting more ambitious pieces. The view from the studio windows showed the gardens and the city skyline beyond, and there was something about the way the morning light hit the fountain that made her want to capture it in watercolors. She was mixing paints on Tuesday morning, completely absorbed in trying to get the exact shade of gold that the sunrise painted on the water, when she heard voices from the floor below. Luciano's voice, and at least two others, men speaking in the kind of low, urgent tones that suggested serious business. Isadora tried to ignore it at first, tried to focus on her painting, but something in the tenor of the conversation made her set down her brush and move closer to the window. The voices were coming from Luciano's home office, and while she couldn't make out specific words, she could hear the tension escalating. Then Luciano's voice rose sharply, switching from English to Italian, and even without understanding the language, she could recognize the tone of a man delivering a threat. There was something in his voice that made her blood run cold, a darkness that reminded her exactly who she'd married and what kind of world she was now part of. The conversation ended abruptly, followed by the sound of the front door closing with more force than necessary. Isadora returned to her easel, but her hands were shaking too much to hold the brush steady. Whatever business Luciano conducted, it wasn't the kind that ended with handshakes and polite goodbyes. That evening, she found him in his mother's library, sitting in one of the leather chairs with a glass of what looked like whiskey, staring at the portrait of the dark-haired woman that dominated the far wall. "She's beautiful," Isadora said softly from the doorway, not wanting to startle him, but drawn to the obvious pain in his posture. Luciano looked up, and for just a moment his carefully controlled mask slipped. She saw exhaustion there, and something that looked like grief so deep and old that it had become part of him. "She was," he agreed, his voice rough around the edges. "Isabella Santori. She died when I was 12. I'm sorry." Isadora stepped into the room, drawn by something in his voice that she'd never heard before. Vulnerability, maybe, or just bone-deep weariness. What happened to her? Luciano's expression immediately shuddered again, and she watched him rebuild his walls in real time. The transformation was so swift and complete that she almost thought she'd imagined the moment of openness. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice back to its usual careful neutrality. But Isadora had seen artists work her entire life, had learned to read the emotions that people tried to hide in their faces the same way she read light and shadow in a painting. The grief in his voice when he spoke about his mother wasn't old and healed. It was fresh and raw and eating him alive from the inside. "She must have loved art very much," Isadora said carefully, gesturing toward the paintings that lined the walls. "This collection is extraordinary. She taught me to see beauty in things," Luciano said, and for just a moment his voice softened again. "She said that no matter how dark the world became, there was always something beautiful if you knew how to look for it. Do you still believe that?" The question slipped out before Isadora could stop it, and she immediately regretted it when she saw his face close off completely. She'd pushed too far, asked for more than he was willing to give. Luciano stood up abruptly, draining his whiskey glass. "I have calls to make," he said, already moving toward the door. "Good night, Isadora." He was gone before she could apologize, leaving her alone with his mother's art and the growing certainty that whatever had happened to Isabella Santori had shaped her son into the man who couldn't bear to be touched by anything beautiful because he was terrified of losing it. 2 days later, a summer storm knocked out power to half the city just as the sun was setting. Isadora was in the kitchen when the lights went out, trying to figure out how to use the intimidating espresso machine. And suddenly, she was standing in complete darkness with the sound of rain hammering against the windows. She was feeling around for a flashlight when she heard footsteps, and then Luciano's voice calling her name. "I'm in the kitchen," she called back, and a few moments later she saw the glow of a phone flashlight approaching. "Are you all right?" Luciano appeared in the doorway, and even in the dim light she could see that he'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. The formal business armor was slipping, and something about the darkness made him seem more human, more approachable. "Fine. Just trying to make coffee before everything went dark." She gestured helplessly at the complicated machine. "I think I may have been overly optimistic about my technical abilities." Luciano almost smiled at that, a real expression instead of the polite masks he usually wore. "Maria keeps emergency supplies in the pantry," he said. "Candles, battery-powered radio. The generator will kick in eventually, but it takes a few minutes." They found the emergency supplies together, working by phone light to distribute candles throughout the kitchen and the adjoining dining room. It was the first time they'd done anything together, the first time Isadora had seen him do something as mundane as lighting candles and checking battery levels. "The generator should have started by now," Luciano said with a frown, checking his watch. "I should go down to the basement and see what's wrong with it." But instead of leaving immediately, he lingered, watching Isadora arrange the candles on the kitchen island in a way that cast warm, dancing light across the marble surfaces. "This is actually kind of nice," she said, settling onto one of the bar stools. "Like camping, but with better countertops." "You've never been camping," Luciano said, and it wasn't a question. "How did you know that? You don't seem like the type." "Too." He paused, searching for the right word. "Civilized." I don't know whether to be flattered or insulted by that. Flattered. Definitely flattered. It was the first real conversation they'd had, the first time he'd spoken to her like she was a person rather than an obligation, and Isadora felt something warm unfurl in her chest that had nothing to do with the candlelight. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you camp?" "I used to." Luciano settled onto the stool across from her, and in the flickering light, he looked younger, less intimidating. "My mother took me camping every summer when I was a kid. She said it was important to remember that all the money and power in the world didn't mean anything if you couldn't survive a night in the woods with just a sleeping bag and a campfire." "That sounds like good advice." She was full of good advice. Luciano's voice went soft with memory, and Isadora held her breath, afraid to break the spell that was making him share pieces of his past. She used to say that the most important thing wasn't how much power you had, but whether you knew the difference between protecting people and controlling them. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Isadora wondered if he was thinking about their marriage, about the way he'd claimed her to pay a debt, about the fine line between protection and possession that defined their relationship. "She sounds like a wise woman," Isadora said carefully. She was, until she wasn't anymore. The sudden bitterness in his voice startled her, and she saw his expression change, saw him remember where he was and who he was talking to. The walls were starting to go back up, but she wasn't ready to let them. "What do you mean?" "Nothing. It doesn't matter." Luciano started to stand, but Isadora reached across the island and touched his hand, the first time she'd initiated physical contact since their wedding day. "It does matter," she said quietly. "I can see that it matters to you." For a moment, he didn't pull away. For a moment, he let her hand rest on his, and she could feel the warmth of his skin, could feel the tension thrumming through him like a live wire. His hands were bigger than hers, scarred across the knuckles in a way that suggested he'd learned to fight long before he'd learned to delegate violence to others. "She thought she could help people," Luciano said finally, his voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear him over the ring. "She thought that because she could see beauty in everything, she could change things. Make them better. Make my father better. What happened to her wasn't an accident." The words came out flat and emotionless, but Isadora could see the pain underneath them, could see the 12-year-old boy who had lost the one person who taught him to see beauty in the world. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Luciano looked down at their joined hands as if he was surprised to find them there, and then slowly, carefully, he turned his hand over so their palms were touching. His skin was warm and calloused, and Isadora felt her heart start beating faster at the simple contact. "She tried to save everyone," he said quietly, "and in the end, she couldn't even save herself." They sat like that for a long time, hands touching in the candlelight while the storm raged outside. Isadora could see him struggling with something, could see the battle between wanting to trust her and the instincts that told him trust was dangerous, that caring about people only gave others power to hurt you. The spell was broken by his phone ringing, the harsh electronic sound cutting through the intimate atmosphere like a knife. Luciano jerked his hand away and answered it immediately, his voice shifting back to the cold, professional tone she knew so well. The conversation was brief and conducted entirely in Italian, but she could tell from his tone that it was important. When he hung up, the moment of connection was gone as completely as if it had never existed. "I have to go," he said, standing up and straightening his tie. "There's a situation that requires immediate attention." "Of course there is," Isadora said, and she couldn't quite keep the disappointment out of her voice. Luciano paused, looking down at her in the candlelight, and for just a moment, she thought he might stay, thought he might choose her over whatever emergency was pulling him away. But then his expression went carefully blank again, and she knew she'd lost him. "The generator should start soon," he said. "Maria will be back in the morning." He left her sitting alone in the candlelit kitchen, surrounded by the romantic atmosphere they'd accidentally created, with the taste of almost intimacy still lingering in the air between them. As she blew out the candles one by one, Isadora tried to ignore the growing certainty that she was falling for a man who might never let himself fall for her in return. And she tried even harder to ignore the fact that she was starting to feel unwell, a nagging fatigue that she attributed to stress, but that seemed to be getting worse each day. Whatever was happening to her body, she couldn't afford to show weakness now, not when she was finally starting to see glimpses of the man behind Luciano's walls. Not when she was beginning to hope that maybe, somehow, this marriage might become something real. Isadora woke up Thursday morning feeling like she was swimming through molasses. The fatigue she'd been ignoring for days had settled into her bones overnight, and when she tried to sit up, the room spun around her in lazy, nauseating circles. She pressed her palms against her temples, trying to steady herself, but her skin felt hot and clammy under her own touch. She'd been pushing herself too hard, that was all. The stress of the marriage, the adjustment to living in Luciano's world, the emotional whiplash of their growing connection and his continued distance. Her body was just telling her to slow down, to take better care of herself. But when she tried to stand, her legs buckled underneath her. Isadora caught herself against the nightstand, her heart racing with sudden fear. This wasn't stress or fatigue. This was something else, something that made her vision blur at the edges and her stomach churn with nausea. She needed water, maybe some aspirin, definitely food since she'd barely eaten anything the day before. She made it to the bathroom through sheer determination, clutching furniture and door frames for support. Her reflection in the mirror startled her. Flushed cheeks, glassy eyes, hair plastered to her head with perspiration. She looked sick in a way that couldn't be hidden or explained away. The fever hit her like a wave while she was trying to splash cold water on her face. One moment she was standing at the sink, and the next she was shivering uncontrollably despite the heat radiating from her skin. Her teeth chattered so hard she bit her tongue, tasting blood, and suddenly the bathroom floor seemed very far away. She barely remembered the fall. When consciousness returned, she was lying on cold marble with no memory of how she'd gotten there. Everything hurt. Her head where it had hit the floor, her ribs where they'd connected with the edge of the bathtub, her entire body from the fever that felt like fire in her veins. She tried to call for help, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Mama," she heard herself say, though her mother had been dead for 3 years. "Mama, I don't feel good." The words sounded pathetic even to her own ears, but she couldn't seem to form anything else. The fever was making her feel like a child again, helpless and frightened, and wanting nothing more than her mother's cool hand on her forehead, her mother's voice telling her everything would be all right. Time became elastic after that. She was dimly aware of trying to get back to bed, of collapsing halfway there when her strength gave out completely. The marble floor of the bedroom felt blessedly cool against her burning skin, and she pressed her cheek against it, grateful for any relief from the heat that seemed to be consuming her from the inside out. She didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway, didn't realize anyone was looking for her until she heard her name being called with increasing urgency. Isadora. Isadora, where are you? Luciano's voice, but different somehow. Worried instead of controlled, almost frantic in a way she'd never heard before. She tried to answer him, tried to tell him she was on the floor beside the bed, but all that came out was a soft moan that barely qualified as sound. Jesus Christ. Suddenly he was there, kneeling beside her on the floor, his hands immediately going to her face, her forehead, checking for injury with a gentleness that would have surprised her if she'd been capable of surprise. His touch felt like ice against her burning skin, and she found herself leaning into it desperately. How long have you been on the floor? Luciano's voice was tight with something that might have been fear, which seemed impossible because Luciano wasn't afraid of anything. What happened? Did you fall? Hot, she managed to whisper. Everything's hot. She felt rather than saw him go still, felt the change in his breathing, the tension that suddenly radiated from him. When he pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, she heard him curse in Italian, words she didn't understand, but that sounded like prayers or threats or both. Your fever is dangerously high, he said, and now his voice was the one she recognized from business calls, crisp and decisive. I'm calling an ambulance. No. The word came out stronger than she'd expected, fueled by sudden panic at the thought of hospitals and doctors and bills they couldn't afford. No hospitals. Please. Isadora, you need medical attention. This fever could kill you. The word kill seemed to echo strangely in her ears, and she realized she was probably more sick than she'd thought. But the idea of adding medical bills to the debt that had already cost her everything was unbearable. She'd rather take her chances with whatever this was than saddle her father with more obligations he couldn't meet. Please, she whispered again. No hospitals. Luciano was quiet for a long moment, and she could feel him studying her face, could feel the war between practical medical sense and whatever instinct was making him reluctant to hand her over to strangers. Finally, he sighed and scooped her up from the floor as if she weighed nothing at all. All right, he said quietly, but we're doing this my way. Isadora found herself pressed against his chest, acutely aware of his strength, his warmth, the way his heart was beating much faster than it should have been. He smelled like expensive soap and coffee and something indefinably masculine that made her want to burrow closer to him despite the fever that was making every nerve-ending scream. Where are we going? She managed to ask as he carried her out of the east wing. Somewhere I can keep an eye on you. He took her to his bedroom, and through her fever haze she was dimly aware of entering a space she'd never seen before. Dark furniture, rich fabrics, masculine and elegant in a way that was purely Luciano. The bed was enormous, probably custom-made, with crisp white linens that looked like they cost more than most people's cars. Luciano laid her down gently, immediately reaching for his phone. But instead of calling an ambulance, he called someone named Antonio and spoke in rapid Italian that sounded like medical terminology mixed with urgent demands. When he hung up, he turned back to her with an expression she'd never seen before, completely focused, almost tender, every wall temporarily abandoned. Antonio is a doctor, he explained, already moving around the room with purposeful efficiency. He'll be here in 20 minutes. Until then, we need to get your temperature down. She watched through half-closed eyes as Luciano gathered supplies from his bathroom, washcloths, towels, a large bowl that he filled with cool water. He moved like a man who'd done this before, who knew exactly what needed to be done, and she wondered dimly who else he'd taken care of, who else had been sick in his bed while he played nurse. This might be cold, he warned, but his hands were infinitely gentle as he placed a damp cloth on her forehead. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Isadora actually whimpered at the sensation of coolness against her burning skin, pressing up into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun. Luciano's expression softened at the sound, and she saw something flicker across his face that looked almost like pain. Better? He asked quietly, and she nodded, not trusting her voice. He worked methodically, replacing the cloth on her forehead when it warmed up, running another damp cloth along her arms and throat, murmuring soft reassurances in Italian that sounded like lullabies. His touch was careful and professional, but there was an intimacy to it that had nothing to do with medical necessity. This was Luciano taking care of her not because he had to, but because he couldn't bear not to. "Tell me about your mother," she heard herself say during one of the moments when her head cleared slightly. "You said she took you camping." Luciano paused in his ministrations, looking down at her with surprise. "You want to talk about my mother while you have a fever of 104? I want to hear your voice," Isadora admitted. "It makes me feel less scared." Something shifted in his expression at that confession, something vulnerable and raw that made her breath catch despite the fever. He resumed the gentle rhythm of cooling her skin, but when he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "She used to make me soup when I was sick," he said quietly. "Terrible soup, actually. She was a brilliant woman but a horrible cook. But she would sit beside my bed and read to me for hours, art history books and poetry and stories about places we would travel together when I got older." "Did you travel together?" "Once. We went to Florence the summer before she died. She wanted to show me the Uffizi, wanted me to see the paintings she'd only been able to show me in books." Luciano's voice grew distant with memory. "She cried when she saw Botticelli's Birth of Venus in person. Said it was different when you could see the brushstrokes, when you could feel the artist's intention in the way the paint caught the light. She sounds wonderful." "She was, until my father's world destroyed her." The bitterness was back in his voice, and Isadora wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to understand the pain that lived behind his walls. But another wave of fever hit her, making everything go white around the edges, and she lost track of the conversation in the haze of heat and nausea. When awareness returned, she found herself curled on her side with Luciano sitting on the edge of the bed beside her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The touch was probably meant to be comforting, but it sent electricity through her even in her weakened state. She wondered if he realized he was touching her, if he knew how much that simple contact meant to her. The doctor arrived while she was drifting in and out of fevered consciousness. Dr. Antonio Marcelli was a small, efficient man who asked pointed questions in accented English and examined her with the kind of thorough professionalism that suggested he was accustomed to treating people who couldn't go to regular hospitals. He took blood samples and administered N4 that made the bedroom feel like a medical suite, all while Luciano hovered nearby, like an anxious guardian. "Severe flu, possibly complicated by exhaustion and stress," Dr. Marcelli pronounced finally. "The 4 will help with dehydration, and I'm leaving antibiotics in case of secondary infection. She needs rest, fluids, and monitoring. If the fever doesn't break in the next 12 hours, she goes to a hospital regardless of preferences." Luciano nodded grimly, already accepting the responsibility of her care as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Thank you, Antonio. I owe you." "You owe me nothing," the doctor said, packing up his supplies. "Just take care of her, and call me if anything changes." After Dr. Marcelli left, Luciano settled into the chair beside the bed and didn't move. Isadora drifted in and out of feverish sleep, but every time she woke up, he was there. Sometimes reading, sometimes making quiet phone calls, sometimes just watching her with an expression of concern that he didn't bother to hide. During one of her more lucid moments in the middle of the night, she found him dozing in the chair, his head tilted back at an angle that was going to give him a terrible crick in his neck. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, and there was something about seeing him rumpled and unguarded that made her chest tight with emotion. "Luciano," she whispered, and his eyes opened immediately, instantly alert. "How do you feel?" he asked, leaning forward to check the cloth on her forehead. "Better," she said, and meant it. The fever had broken sometime while she slept, leaving her weak but clear-headed for the first time in days. "You should get some rest. You don't have to stay awake to watch me." "Yes, I do," he said simply, and the certainty in his voice made something warm unfurl in her chest that had nothing to do with illness. "Why?" she asked quietly. "I'm just your wife on paper, remember?" Luciano went very still at her words, and she saw something like shame flicker across his features. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "No," he said, "you're not." The admission hung between them in the darkness, heavy with implication and possibility. Isadora felt her heart start beating faster, and this time it had nothing to do with fever. What am I then? She asked, hardly daring to breathe. Luciano looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him struggling with something, could see the battle between what he wanted to say and what he thought he should say. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. "You're the woman who makes me want to be someone worth saving," he said quietly. "You're the woman who looks at me like I might be capable of being good, despite everything you know about what I do, what I am. You're—" His phone rang, cutting through the intimate moment like a chainsaw through silk. Luciano closed his eyes for a moment, and Isadora could see him struggling with the decision of whether to answer it. "Take it," she said quietly, even though every part of her wanted him to ignore it, wanted him to finish what he'd been about to say. Luciano looked at the caller ID and cursed softly. "It's an emergency," he said apologetically. "I have to." "I know," Isadora said, and she did know. She'd learned that in his world, emergencies weren't optional, that the phone calls that came in the middle of the night were usually matters of life and death. But as he stepped out of the room to take the call, Isadora couldn't help feeling like she'd just lost something precious, like they'd been on the verge of something real and beautiful that might never come again. The business call lasted 2 hours, and when Luciano returned to the bedroom, Isadora could see the weight of whatever crisis he'd been dealing with written across his face. His shoulders were tense, his jaw set in the hard line she'd learned to recognize as his way of preparing for war. But when he looked at her, propped up against the pillows and clearly feeling better, something in his expression softened. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling back into the chair beside the bed. "Much better. The fever broke while you were gone." Isadora studied his face, noting the new lines of stress around his eyes. "What's wrong? And don't say nothing. I can see that something's happened." Luciano was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him weighing how much to tell her, how much of his world to let her glimpse. Finally, he sighed and ran his hands through his hair. "There's been a development with the Torino situation," he said carefully. "They're not happy about our arrangement." "Our marriage, you mean?" "Among other things." Luciano's voice was grim. "They had plans for you that didn't involve you actually being protected by a husband." The words sent a chill down Isadora's spine that had nothing to do with her recent fever. She'd known, intellectually, that marrying Luciano had probably angered the people her father owed money to. But she hadn't really considered what that might mean in practical terms, what kind of retaliation they might plan. "What kind of plans?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "The kind that would have made your father wish he'd found another way to pay his debts." Isadora closed her eyes, feeling sick again, but for completely different reasons. She'd known her marriage was a business transaction, but she'd thought it was a clean one, her freedom for her father's safety. She hadn't considered that she might have been trading one kind of danger for another. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now I handle it," Luciano said, and there was something in his voice that reminded her exactly who she'd married, exactly what he was capable of when someone threatened what he considered his. "How?" The question seemed to surprise him, and she realized he probably wasn't accustomed to explaining his decisions to anyone, certainly not to wives who were supposed to be just legal arrangements. "By making it clear that you're under my protection," he said finally. "By ensuring they understand the consequences of pursuing their original plans. And if they don't care about the consequences, then they'll learn to care." The cold certainty in his voice should have frightened her, but instead Isadora found herself feeling safer than she had since her father's confession about his gambling debts. Whatever else Luciano was, whatever dark things he was capable of, he was protecting her. Not because he had to, but because he'd chosen to. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm sorry that marrying me created problems for you." Luciano looked at her with something like shock, as if the idea that she might apologize for being threatened was completely foreign to him. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said firmly. "This isn't your fault, Isadora. None of this is your fault, isn't it? My father gambled away everything we had, and then used me as collateral. I could have refused, could have found some other way." "What other way?" Luciano's voice was gentler now, and she could see genuine concern in his eyes. "You were facing impossible choices with no good options. That's not your fault either." The kindness in his voice almost undid her, and Isadora felt tears threatening for the first time since she'd gotten sick. She'd been so focused on surviving, on adapting to this new life, that she hadn't allowed herself to really feel the grief of everything she'd lost. Her freedom, her dreams, her chance at the kind of love she'd always imagined having. But looking at Luciano now, seeing the way he was watching her with such careful attention, she realized that maybe she hadn't lost as much as she'd thought. Maybe she'd even gained something she hadn't expected to find. "Tell me about your mother," she said suddenly. "I mean, really tell me. What happened to her?" Luciano went very still, and she could see him building his walls again, preparing to deflect the question the way he always did when the conversation turned too personal. But then he looked at her lying in his bed, still pale from illness, still trusting him despite everything, and something in his resolve seemed to crack. "She was murdered," he said quietly, "when I was 12 years old. Shot 3 times in the chest while I watched from the closet where she'd hidden me." The words hit Isadora like a physical blow, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. She'd known something terrible had happened to his mother, had seen the pain in his eyes whenever he mentioned her, but she hadn't imagined anything this brutal, this traumatic. "Oh God, Luciano, I'm so sorry." She tried to help people, he continued, his voice flat and emotionless in the way that suggested he was reciting facts to keep from feeling them. "My father's business associates, their wives, their children." She thought she could use her position to make a difference, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. "Like you're protecting me," Isadora said softly, and saw him flinch at the comparison. "Like I failed to protect her," he corrected harshly. "She trusted me to watch the hallway while she met with someone who was asking for help. I was supposed to warn her if anyone came. But I was 12 and scared and I missed the signs. You were a child. I was her son." Luciano's voice broke slightly on the words. "I was supposed to keep her safe, and instead I hid in a closet while they killed her for trying to be good in a world that punishes goodness." The anguish in his voice was so raw, so immediate, that Isadora felt like she was seeing into his 12-year-old heart, seeing the moment when the boy who believed in beauty and goodness had died along with his mother. Everything about him suddenly made sense. The emotional walls, the refusal to let anyone close, the way he treated their marriage like a business arrangement. He was terrified of caring about someone again, terrified of failing to protect them the way he'd failed to protect the person who mattered most. "That's why you keep everyone at a distance," she said gently. "You think if you don't love anyone, you can't lose them." Luciano looked at her with something like surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to understand so completely. "It's worked for 20 years, he said quietly. "Has it?" Isadora asked. "Has it really worked, or have you just been surviving instead of living?" The question seemed to hit him like a physical blow, and she saw him struggle with it, saw the battle between the man he'd forced himself to become and the boy who had once believed in his mother's dreams of beauty and goodness. "I don't know how to be anything else," he admitted finally, and the vulnerability in his voice nearly broke her heart. "You could learn," she said softly, "if you wanted to, if you thought it was worth the risk. What if I fail again? What if I can't protect you the way I couldn't protect her? Then we'll fail together," Isadora said simply. "But at least we'll have tried to be happy instead of just safe." She saw the exact moment when something shifted in his expression, when 20 years of careful emotional control began to crumble under the weight of possibility. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, like he was allowing himself to really see what she was offering him. "You're not just my wife on paper anymore, are you?" he said quietly, and it wasn't really a question. "No," Isadora said, her heart beating so fast she was sure he could hear it. "I don't think I ever was." Luciano stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving her face, and she could see him making a decision that she knew was costing him everything he'd built to protect himself. "Isadora," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to know that if you let me love you, if you let me try to be the man you see when you look at me, I won't be able to let you go. Ever. Even if it's dangerous, even if it puts you at risk, even if the smart thing would be to send you away where you'd be safe." "I don't want to be safe," she said, sitting up straighter despite her lingering weakness. "I want to be with you. I want to try to build something real out of this arrangement we were forced into. Even knowing what I am, what I do, especially knowing what you are," Isadora said firmly. "You're not just a crime boss, Luciano. You're a man who sat beside my bed all night when I was sick. You're a man who still keeps his mother's books because she taught you to see beauty in dark places. You're a man who's capable of love, even if you're afraid of it. The words seemed to break something loose inside him, and suddenly he was moving toward the bed, sitting on the edge of it, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I love you," he said quietly, the words seeming to surprise him even as he spoke them. "God help me. I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you tried to make me pancakes." Isadora felt tears spill over at the admission, at the wonder and terror in his voice as he said the words he probably thought he'd never say again. "I love you too," she whispered. "I know I'm not supposed to. I know this was supposed to be just an arrangement, but I do. I love you." When he kissed her, it was nothing like the perfunctory kiss at their wedding ceremony. This was desperate and hungry and full of 20 years of suppressed emotion, finally finding an outlet. Isadora kissed him back with equal desperation, pouring all of her own suppressed feelings into the contact, all of her hope and fear and desire. "Are you strong enough?" he asked against her lips, and she could hear the restraint in his voice, could feel him holding himself back. "I'm strong enough," she said, pulling him closer. "I'm strong enough for this." What followed was tender and passionate, and unlike anything Isadora had ever experienced. Luciano made love to her like she was precious, like she was something he'd thought he'd lost forever and had miraculously found again. He whispered endearments in Italian against her skin, told her she was beautiful, told her he'd kill anyone who tried to take her away from him. Afterward, they lay tangled together in his bed, and Isadora felt like everything had changed between them. The careful distance was gone, replaced by an intimacy that felt as natural as breathing. When Luciano's phone rang again, he ignored it completely. "Shouldn't you answer that?" Isadora asked, tracing patterns on his chest with her fingertip. "No," Luciano said firmly, tightening his arms around her. "Whatever it is, it can wait. Right now, the only thing that matters is that you're here and you're safe and you're mine." The possessiveness in his voice should have bothered her, but instead it made her feel cherished, protected in a way she'd never experienced before. She was his, but more importantly, he was hers too. They belonged to each other now, whatever dangers that might bring. When the phone finally stopped ringing, the silence felt like a victory. They'd chosen each other over the obligations and emergencies that had kept them apart, chosen love over the safety of emotional distance. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The Torino problem was resolved within 48 hours, though Isadora never learned all the details. What she did know was that Luciano made 3 phone calls, held 2 meetings, and had one very brief conversation with someone who sounded terrified on the other end of the line. After that, the threats simply stopped. When she asked him about it, Luciano's only explanation was that some people needed to be reminded about the natural order of things, and that the Torinos had been encouraged to focus their attention elsewhere. The way he said it, with that particular tone of quiet satisfaction, made Isadora suspect that the encouragement had been more persuasive than polite. But she found that she didn't care about the details. Her father's debts were cleared, the threats against her were gone, and she was free to build a life with the man she loved without looking over her shoulder. Everything else was just business. The real change came in the weeks that followed, as they learned to live together as a couple who had chosen each other rather than strangers bound by legal obligation. Luciano moved her things from the East Wing into his bedroom without asking, a presumption that should have annoyed her, but instead made her feel claimed and cherished. They shared meals now, shared conversations that lasted long into the night, shared the kind of domestic intimacy that Isadora had once thought would be impossible with a man like him. He was still dangerous, still commanded respect and fear from people in his world. But with her, he was gentle, patient, surprisingly funny once he allowed himself to relax enough to show his sense of humor. He brought her coffee in the morning and listened to her talk about the paintings she was working on in his mother's studio. He answered his business calls in other rooms now, protecting her from the harsher realities of his work while never pretending that those realities didn't exist. 3 weeks after she'd recovered from the fever, Luciano surprised her with an announcement over breakfast. "I've been thinking about our wedding," he said, his voice carefully casual in a way that suggested the topic was more important to him than he was letting on. "What about it?" Isadora asked, looking up from the art history book she'd been reading while she ate. "It wasn't really ours, was it? It was a legal formality, a business transaction. We never got to choose each other." Isadora set down her book, giving him her full attention. What are you saying? I'm saying that I'd like to marry you properly, Luciano said, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. I'd like to stand up in front of people who matter to us and promise to love you for the rest of my life because I want to, not because a contract says I have to. The proposal was so unexpected, so perfectly him, that Isadora felt tears start to well up in her eyes. They were already married, already living as husband and wife, but he was offering her something she'd thought she'd lost forever, the chance to be a bride who was wanted rather than traded. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I would love to marry you properly. The second wedding was everything the first one hadn't been. Small and intimate, held in the garden where they'd had their first real conversation, with only the people they genuinely cared about in attendance. Vincent walked her down the aisle again, but this time his eyes were bright with joy rather than guilt. Maria and Dr. Marcelli were there, along with a few of Luciano's business associates who had become genuine friends rather than just allies. But the real difference was in the way Luciano looked at her as she walked toward him. There was no cold assessment, no businesslike evaluation. Just love, pure and uncomplicated and so intense that everyone present could see it. When they exchanged vows this time, they were promises they meant, words that came from the heart rather than legal obligation. I promise to love you not because I have to, but because I can't imagine not loving you, Luciano said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. I promise to protect you not because you belong to me, but because you chose me. I promise to be worthy of the faith you've shown in me, even when I couldn't show it in myself. When Isadora spoke her own vows, she looked directly into his green-gray eyes and saw her future there. Challenging and beautiful and utterly different from anything she'd planned, but perfect in its own way. I promise to love you not despite who you are, but because of who you are, she said. I promise to stand beside you in your world while helping you remember that there's beauty in it worth protecting. I promise to choose you every day, not because I have to, but because I want to. When they kissed as husband and wife for the second time, it felt like a beginning rather than an ending. The months that followed established new rhythms, new traditions, new ways of being together that felt natural and right. Luciano began transitioning more of his business interests toward legitimate enterprises, partly because of pressure from law enforcement, but mostly because Isadora's presence in his life had given him reasons to want a future that didn't involve looking over his shoulder constantly. She finished several paintings in his mother's studio, including a portrait of Isabella Santori that she painted from the photograph in the library. When she showed it to Luciano, he stood in front of it for a long time without speaking, and she saw tears in his eyes that he didn't try to hide. She would have loved you, he said finally. She would have loved how you see beauty in everything, how you make me remember what it feels like to hope for things. I wish I could have met her, Isadora said, slipping her hand into his. But I feel like I know her through her books, through the way she raised you to appreciate art and beauty even in a world that tried to make you hard. She's the reason I could recognize what you were offering me, Luciano admitted. Even after all these years, even after I thought I'd forgotten everything she taught me, some part of me remembered that love was worth the risk. 6 months after their second wedding, Isadora discovered she was pregnant. She told Luciano over dinner, simply and directly, watching his face transform from surprise to wonder to a joy so profound it took her breath away. He was out of his chair and lifting her up before she could say another word, spinning her around the dining room while she laughed and protested that he was going to make her dizzy. A baby, he said, setting her down gently and immediately placing protective hands on her still flat stomach. Our baby. Are you happy? Isadora asked, though his expression made the answer obvious. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Luciano said, his voice thick with emotion. Terrified, thrilled, completely overwhelmed, ready to kill anyone who even looks at you wrong for the next 9 months. But yes, happy. The pregnancy transformed him in ways Isadora hadn't expected. The man who had built his life around emotional control became almost embarrassingly protective, hovering over her with a devotion that would have been annoying if it hadn't been so obviously motivated by love. He read pregnancy books, baby-proofed the mansion before she was even showing, and spoke to her belly in Italian every night before they went to sleep. Dr. Marcelli became a frequent visitor, monitoring her progress with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for royalty. Luciano had apparently made it clear that nothing was too good for his wife and child, and the doctor took his responsibilities seriously. When she was 7 months pregnant, round and glowing and more beautiful than she'd ever been in her life, according to Luciano's daily pronouncements, they had their last real conversation about the past. "Do you ever regret it?" Luciano asked one evening as they sat together in the library, Isadora reading while he worked on business plans for his latest legitimate venture. "Giving up your old life, your plans, everything you thought you wanted?" Isadora looked up from her book, studying his face in the lamplight. He looked younger than he had when she'd first met him, the hard edges softened by happiness and the security of knowing he was loved. The shadows that had lived in his eyes for so long were almost completely gone now, replaced by warmth and contentment. "Never," she said firmly. "This life, this family we're building, this love we found in the middle of an impossible situation, it's better than anything I could have planned for myself. Even though it started with your father's gambling debts and a business arrangement?" "Especially because it started that way," Isadora said, setting down her book and moving to sit on the arm of his chair. "If we'd met under normal circumstances, I probably would have been too intimidated by you to give us a real chance. And you would have been too careful to let anyone close enough to matter. So you think we needed the forced proximity?" "I think we needed to see each other when we thought no one was watching, when we couldn't pretend to be anything other than who we really were. I fell in love with the man who sat by my bed when I was sick, who shared his mother's memories, who chose to trust me with his heart despite everything that had taught him not to trust anyone." Luciano reached up to cup her face, thumb stroking gently across her cheek. "And I fell in love with the woman who looked at me like I was worth saving, who saw possibilities I couldn't see in myself, who chose to love me even after she knew what loving me would cost her." The baby kicked then, as if responding to their conversation, and they both laughed at the perfect timing. Luciano's hand immediately went to her belly, and Isadora covered it with her own, marveling at how right it felt to be planning a future together. 1 year later, Isadora woke up to the sound of her husband making coffee in the kitchen and her 6-month-old daughter babbling happily in her crib. Through the bedroom windows, she could see the gardens where they'd had their second wedding ceremony, where Luciano had finally learned to believe in beauty and love again. She found them in the breakfast nook, Luciano holding baby Sofia, while she grabbed at everything within reach with the determined focus of someone exploring an exciting new world. He was speaking to her in soft Italian, and their daughter was listening with the serious attention of someone who found his voice absolutely fascinating. "Good morning, beautiful girls," Luciano said when he saw Isadora, his smile brightening in the way that still made her heart skip beats. "Coffee's ready, and Sofia has been asking for her mama for the last 20 minutes. She's 6 months old," Isadora said, accepting the coffee he handed her and settling into the chair beside them. "She doesn't ask for anything except milk and clean diapers. She's very advanced for her age," Luciano said solemnly, pressing a kiss to Sofia's dark hair. "She definitely said mama earlier, and I think she was commenting on the quality of my coffee-making skills." Isadora laughed, leaning over to kiss both her husband and her daughter, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and the expensive cologne that Luciano still wore even for breakfast at home. This was her life now. Mornings in the kitchen with the man she loved and the child they'd created together, surrounded by the kind of domestic happiness she'd once thought was only for other people. Later, as she painted in the studio while Sofia napped and Luciano worked in his home office, Isadora thought about how impossible this would have seemed 2 years ago. She'd been a struggling art student facing an arranged marriage to a stranger, and he'd been a man who believed love was a weakness he couldn't afford. Now she was a wife, a mother, an artist with a studio full of paintings that galleries were starting to notice. She was married to a man who had transformed his business empire into something largely legitimate, who donated anonymously to art programs and education initiatives, who kissed her goodbye every morning like he couldn't bear to be away from her even for a few hours. They'd built something beautiful out of the worst possible circumstances, had found love in a place where love shouldn't have been possible. And every day, they chose each other again. As the afternoon light slanted through the studio windows, Isadora started a new painting. A family portrait of the three of them in the garden, surrounded by the roses that bloomed every spring in the space where they'd promised to love each other for the rest of their lives. It would be her gift to Luciano for their second anniversary, a reminder of how far they'd traveled together and how much beauty they'd managed to create. When Sofia woke up from her nap, Luciano appeared in the studio doorway holding their daughter, both of them looking at Isadora with identical expressions of adoration that never failed to make her feel like the luckiest woman in the world. What moment made you believe that love could conquer even the deepest fears, that two people who should have been strangers could build something lasting and beautiful together? Share your thoughts below, because this story is proof that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings can lead to the most extraordinary endings. Outside the studio windows, the sun was setting over the gardens where they'd learned to choose love over safety, trust over fear, and hope over the wounds that had once seemed impossible to heal. In Luciano's arms, Sofia reached toward Isadora with chubby fingers, and Isadora set down her brush to take her daughter from the man who had started as her husband on paper and become the love of her life. This was their family, built not on obligation or arrangement, but on the radical decision to risk everything for the chance to love and be loved in return. And as they stood together in the golden light, surrounded by the paintings that captured their journey from strangers to soulmates, Isadora knew that every difficult choice, every moment of fear, every leap of faith had been worth it for this. A lifetime of mornings in the kitchen, evenings in the garden, and the quiet certainty that they would choose each other again and again, no matter what tomorrow might bring.